Chapter 5. Gaia and Durotan assisted Garad with his battle armor. It differed from hunting armor in that it was specifically designed to block blows from axes, hammers, and maces, as opposed to hooves or horns. Beasts attacked the center of mass, the chest and legs. Orcs went for these as well, but the shoulders and throat were particularly vulnerable on an orc wielding a weapon designed for close combat. Throats were guarded with thick leather collars, and the shoulders sported massive pads studded with metal spikes. But for a race where honor was all, armor was less important than the weapons, and the weapons that orcs bore into battle were massive. The weapon bequeathed to Orgrim was the Doomhammer, for which his family was named. The huge chunk of granite was wrapped twice around with gold-studded leather and affixed to a thick, oaken haft that was almost a weapon in itself. Thunderstrike was Garad's hereditary weapon of choice for the hunt, but the huge axe he had named Sever was his weapon for battle. With two blades of steel honed meticulously to a leaf-thin sharpness, Sever did exactly what it was named for. Seldom did Garad strap it to his back, but he wore it with pride today. Durotan had never been prouder to call himself a son of Garad than when his father emerged a short time later. He strode from his hut as straight as Durotan had ever seen him, his dark eyes flashing with righteous rage. Orgrim had already been speaking to the warriors of the clan, and most of them, too, had donned battle armor. "Frostwolves!" Garad's voice rang out. "My son brings news of intruders into our forest. Orcs who do not approach our territory openly, as a hunting party would, but who skulk and hide. They hew limbs from our trees, and they reek of old blood." Durotan fought back an instinctive shiver at the memory. Any orc would deem the scent of fresh blood, spilled in the name of sustenance or honor, a good smell. But old blood, that stale, musty stench of spoilage, no orc would choose to wear it. A warrior reveled in blood, then cleansed afterwards, donning fresh clothing for the celebration to follow. Were these the Red Walkers Gul'dan had spoken of? Was this why they named themselves thus? Because they were always covered in the blood of their kill? When Gul'dan had mentioned them, Durotan had been inclined to welcome them, should they arrive in Frostwolf territory. Any orc who refused the warlock was an orc to respect, or so he had believed, until he had scented them. Things slain should be allowed to move on. The souls of orcs, and the souls of little brothers and sisters, such as the cleft hooves, even down to the smallest snow rabbit. They were slain and eaten or burned, returning to the earth, water, air, and fire. Pelts were cleaned and tanned, never worn rotting and bloody. The thought appalled Durotan, as it did every Frostwolf who listened attentively to their chieftain's words. "We will ride to confront these intruders," Garad continued. "We will drive them from our forests, or slay them where they stand." He lifted Sever and bellowed, "Lokta Olgar!" Victory or death. The Frostwolves took up the cry, shouting along with him as they raced to their equally eager wolves. Durotan leapt atop Sharptooth, casting a quick glance over his unarmored shoulder at his father. For just an instant, the weariness that had prostrated Garad a short time ago flitted across the chieftain's features. Then, with what Durotan knew to be an effort of sheer, stubborn determination, Garad banished it. Durotan's throat suddenly felt tight, as if squeezed by an unseen hand. Garad forced his sluggish mind to focus as he rode. The Frostwolves raced toward the cluster of violated trees with no semblance of secrecy. His son and Orgrim had reported seeing the footprints of 7, but doubtless there were more. It was even possible that the main force outnumbered the Frostwolves, who had never boasted great numbers. One thing was certain: neither orc had seen any sign that the intruders had wolves. In the end, the Red Walkers, if such they were, would be facing more than a score of warriors. In truth, twice as many, as the Frostwolves themselves had been trained to fight alongside the orcs they regarded more as friends than as masters. It would be sufficient to wipe them out. At least, Garad had to hope it would be. And he had to hope he would last long enough to do what he had come to do, return home and continue fighting this crippling, cursed weakness. The symptoms resembled those caused by the bite of a lowly but dangerous insect the orcs called a digger. The victim was enfeebled for days at a time, with a lack of energy and strength uniquely terrifying to an orc. Agony, racking convulsions, a shattered limb, these things orcs knew how to embrace. The listlessness and lethargy evoked by this insect truly frightened them. But neither Gear nor Drektar had found evidence that he had been bitten by a digger, and Drektar had heard nothing at all from the spirits as to the nature of this mystery illness. When Durotan had come with his talk of blood-steeped enemies, Garad had known it was a sign. He would rise and fight. He would rally and defeat this malady, just as he had every other enemy. A victory brought by action would also be good for the clan's morale. Gul'dan's dire foreboding, his unsettling presence, his strange slave, and, above all, his green skin, it had cast an unwholesome shadow upon the Frostwolves. Bloodshed of an enemy would hearten them immensely, and Garad longed to be once again spattered with the hot blood of a justified kill. Perhaps this was a test, sent by the spirits, and triumph would restore his vigor. Illness had stalked the clan, even its chieftain, ere now. As he had done before, he would repel it. The arrogant interlopers had left a broad trail from the wounded trees, their footprints dark smudges on trampled snow. The Frostwolves followed, overwriting the tracks with the paw prints of their mounts. The trail led to the grey curve of the foothills, the peak of Great Father Mountain lost to view in the low clouds. The strange orcs were expecting them, and Garad was glad of it. They stood in a line, straight and silent, their number a mere 17. While the Frostwolves wore armour and bore weapons that reflected their northern heritage, the intruders wore a strange jumble of armour styles. Boiled leather, fur, metal plating. Their weapons were similarly mismatched. But that was not what brought some of his clan members up sharply. Garad knew it was the sight of their armour, their skin, their faces, all covered in handprints of crusted, dark, dried, reeking blood. One orc, the largest and most physically intimidating of the group, stood in the centre, a few paces ahead of the others. Garad assumed he was their leader. His head was shaved, and he wore no helmet. Garad gazed at him with contempt. These red walkers, if such they were, would not long survive in the north. Warriors kept their hair and covered their skulls here in the cold lands. Orgrim was the only Frostwolf who rebelled. Hair and helmets helped preserve warmth, and the skull in question atop one's shoulders. Garad would remove that bald head, watch it land in the snow, and melt it with hot blood. Earlier, Geir had urged him to stay out of the fray, begged almost. She had never done so before, and her fear alarmed him more than his illness did. She was the most courageous orc he had ever known, but he saw now that he was her one weakness. They had been a mated pair for so long, Garad could not imagine life without her charging into the fight by his side. But here he was, and he knew why she had chosen to stay behind. This wasting sickness was unbecoming of an orc, and it would not stand. He would not let it. He would not condemn his Geir to riding without him. He growled low in his throat, summoning all his strength and channeling it toward two things, raising Sever and opening his mouth to shout a battle cry. His voice was almost immediately joined by the other Frostwolves. He was flanked by his son and Orgrim, and as they and Gaia had done many times before, they rode forward as a unit, tight and terrifying, their wolves so close they touched, before each broke off and headed toward his own target. Garad focused on the leader. As he watched, the other smiled and nodded. He held an axe that shone with something sticky. Tree sap. Doubtless this disrespectful orc had used it earlier to hack the limbs off the trees. Garad let his anger at the act fuel him, and he felt energy start to rise within him, real energy, if bought from bloodlust. The bald orc cried out and raced towards him, thick legs propelling him forward as swiftly as the snow would permit. But an orc on foot was no match for a mounted frostwolf, and Garad bore down upon his enemy, grinning. Ice, too, was ready to fight. His jaws were open, red tongue lolling over sharp white teeth. Garad lifted Sever, both hands wrapped around its hilt, timing the moment where he would lean over and slice off the enemy's head. But then the orc shouted, "Mak'gora!" Abruptly, Garad shifted his weight, and Ice veered off awkwardly. Garad had never heard of an orc issuing the Mak'gora in the middle of a battle. The Red Walkers were facing certain defeat. To ask for the outcome to be decided by single combat was pure cowardice. Had it been the Frostwolves with so few, they would know they claimed honor by fighting to their deaths against overwhelming odds. They would never try to alter the outcome by reducing it to a one-on-one fight. Garad's disgust with this Red Walker grew, but concern flickered through him as well. Ordinarily, he would likely be more than a match for this Southlander, but this was not an ordinary time, and his limbs were already threatening to turn traitor. He could not rely on his strength remaining. But how could he pretend he didn't hear the challenge? If others heard it and saw he did not honor the Mak'gora, the shame would be Garad's, not the interlopers. His enemy saw the conflict on Garad's face, and a cruel grin twisted his mouth around his tusks. The insolence was too much to be borne. Garad leapt off Ice. He stumbled ever so slightly, but recovered quickly, setting his will to it. "You are strong," he told himself. "This sickness will pass. It will not claim you. You are a chieftain, and it is nothing. You will defeat this challenger, and your Frostwolves will wipe out the Red Walkers." "I accept," he snarled, and charged. As if the mighty Sever was nothing more than a child's training toy, the bald orc's sap-fouled axe struck it and shoved it aside with shocking ease. Garad recovered, gripping the weapon tightly, striving not to fall. To lose his footing would be death. The Red Walker went on the offensive now, and Garad grunted with the effort of simply lifting Sever to block the deadly blows. It was all he could do. There was no strength remaining in his arms, his legs, anywhere in his body to mount an attack. Too late, he understood that he had chosen poorly in allowing himself to be goaded into this. Anguish and rage flowed through him, enough for him to rally, heft the great axe, and bring it down in a final, strong, horizontal strike. But the other orc was not there. He had leapt aside, and now laughed openly at Garad's efforts. Elsewhere, the Frostwolves were the clear victors in this battle. The Red Walkers fought well, but they were struggling in the snow and faced greater numbers. The bald orc looked around, smirking. "I had best end this quickly," he said. "As only you and I know, this is a Mak'gora." He lifted his axe. Garad grunted angrily and struggled to lift Sever in return. Helplessly, he watched his arms quiver as he raised the axe only a few inches before it fell from his weak fingers. Even so. Let it be thus, Garad thought. I will die in a fair... And suddenly, he understood. Garad's enemy had known he would be easy to defeat. The knife. Gul'dan's blade. His gut went as cold as winter with stark comprehension. And the Red Walker's axe descended.